Hello, this is Mario Basile from the Movimento Tradizionale Romano. This is the video number 10 of this brief course on Roman religion, the last video, and I cannot stop without an analysis on the reasons why the Gentile Roman religion disappeared for many centuries. The Gentile Roman religion in the first millennium of the Common Era disappeared from the scenario of the empire to the point where today many incautious conservatives and traditionalist Italian politicians speak exclusively of the Christian roots of Europe, without considering that our language, our culture, the concept of state and law, our way of being is much older, and that in reality, even Christianity of Semitic origin, in the Italian form of Catholicism, with its saints, its feasts, the Latin language, its symbols and offices such as Pontifex Maximus, and even a part of its theology is the result of an adaptation to the previous Roman ideas. The objective of today's discussion is not the contrast between Christians and pagans. We are all too tired of the extreme simplification of every opinion, including politics, where everything comes down to a like or a thumbs down. Furthermore, considering the time span of millennia, none of us would know how, when, and why our ancestors converted to Christianity, whether by conviction or by compulsion. Today's theme instead is to dismantle the prejudices installed by centuries of disinformation towards the Gentile Roman religion. So, if you want, follow me. The Christian historical narrative does a great injustice to Roman Gentile religion. And while many topics have been corrected or at least have been covered by a pitiful veil of silence, see for example the discussion on whether women had a soul or not, see the witch hunt, see carnal relations with the devil, see the relationship with science. Remember that Galileo Galilei was only rehabilitated by the Catholic Church in 1992, the Christian narrative on pagan Romans still remains untouched, and a set of nonsense, allow me the term, is still taught today in schools, and in any case there are a lot of wrong stereotypes. Let's look some quick examples. So, the Romans are often described as the people of unbridled orgies without any moral, ethical, or religious sense, yet they were considered the most religious people of antiquity. The Romans used to torture the poor Christians. It wasn't exactly like that. The number of martyrs need to be reduced. The Romans didn't wage wars of religion. The Roman religion had no substance. It was cold, and therefore everyone welcomed Christianity as a liberation. And we know from historical sources that Christianity imposed itself with violence and blood. That the Roman Empire was donated by Constantine to the Church, a huge historical falsehood unmasked in 1517 by Lorenzo Valla, but still taught in schools. That the Church Fathers were learned and were an example of truth and wisdom toward the ancient, ignorant world. Quite the opposite is true. Many Church Fathers today would appear similar to the Talibans. That monotheism is the natural spiritual development of the human being. It is an opinion, like any other, easily dismantled. And if science has managed to confirm that Earth is not the center of the universe, despite the Church, the time has come to make an authentic apology of the Gentile Roman religion against the nonsense that it is still taught in school today. This disinformation is a consequence of a work of removal perpetuated for centuries by the political and religious power. 4th century Christianity describes a heroic age in which miracles happened and Satan was fought against at the time of St. Augustine and St. Ambrose, when Christianity was taking the power in the Roman Empire. Today, we will see this as the age of delirium, of madness. The full title of St. Augustine's most famous book is The City of God Against the Pagans. The pagans are defined as masters of depravity, lovers of obscenities. Augustine developed a demonology that today is simply embarrassing and for this reason kept in silence. The great enemy was the legion of evil, stinking devils, tempters and fornicators to be fought to the death. These devils were identified with the gods of the polytheistic religion. Yes, the new religion was fighting against the old one by saying that Jupiter, Venus, Bacchus, but also the goddess Isis with her son at her breast were evil demons. Augustine says all pagans are under the influence of demons. Altars have been made for demons, sacrifices for demons, priests ordained for demons, and augurs inspired by demons. The demons had created the Greek-Roman religion to savor the offerings. This is the start of the hysterical Christian desire for purity and the willingness to destroy everything that was traditional but not Christian, just like the Taliban, because it was not simply another form of spirituality, but the work of Satan. This is still true today, where in many Christian groups the charge of paganism equates to satanic. The intellectuals of the time did not like Christians. Galenus, one of the first empiricists, studied the human body, laying the foundation of the medicine of the time. On the conservatives of the time, he said that they were harder on the uptake than the followers of Christ and Moses. This is how he described the Christians' methods, writing without proving evidence, saying, God has spoken, God wants it. Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius mentioned the Christians without giving much detail, even if Pliny's bewilderment is considerable. But the real alarm of the ancient world is the monumental work of Celsus, who knows the scriptures and argues with a systematic work on the new religion, not only with contempt, but above all with concern for the ignorance that advances. Unfortunately, Celsus was prophetic. 150 years after his work, a Roman emperor declared himself a Christian. Celsus' work was set on fire according to a practice followed by Christianity for more than a millennium. Today we know the contents of the work of Celsus thanks to the church fathers that were clumsy attempting to answer to Celsus' critics. There is a reconstructed version. I recommend reading it because it goes deep into Christian theology, showing the point of view of the traditional religion and of the Cives Romanus towards the advancing obscurantism. And Porphyry also wrote a theological work to demonstrate the absurdities of the new religion, against the battle of Christianity to the single truth, single doctrine, the identification of Satan in every place. Celsus said, there is nothing wrong if every people follow its own religious rule. I repeat, there is nothing wrong if every people follow their own religious rules. But this thought, which today would go hand in hand with law, horrified Christians' mind. We strongly believe that every victim with her or his identity, history, personality is to be respected. But let's review the number of martyrs, not for a macabre accounting, but to understand the extent of the phenomenon, which had very little to do with the inculcated Christian narrative from the Middle Age on. Let's start from a principle. The Roman Empire was tolerant of other religions and had not even a shadow of the nascent Christian fanaticism. Nero was feared by everyone. From what is reported, he was a madman and killed and tortured many people, including a group of Christians taken as scapegoat for the fire in Rome. In 64, 30 years after Christ's death, we cannot expect that there was a crowd of Christians in Rome, but a small group. The so-called persecution, as defined by Christian history, never had the objective of eliminating Christians. The Emperor Decius, who was conservative, in 250 issued an edict to ensure the loyalty of the citizen and required all the population to offer him a sacrifice. But some Christians refused to do so, seeing the emperor as a messenger of Satan, and paid the consequences, as they were not loyal to the Roman state. Let us not forget that until a few years ago in Italy, Catholics mocked the Jehovah's Witnesses for not taking the oath to the Italian state for military service, for the very same principle that had generated the Christian martyrs. The persecution of Decius lasted a few months. 7 years later, the Emperor Valerian directly attacked the church and its powerful bishops, but executions were sporadic and Valerian soon died in battle. Under the Emperor Diocletian, the clash with the Christians was now a matter of power, and in fact, a few decades later, Constantine saw the convenience in declaring himself a Christian. With Diocletian, the persecutions were aimed at the elimination of the Christians from public offices, so that they would not be in power. Throughout Roman history, there were 13 years of persecution, with a number of martyrs that certainly does not justify the narrative that followed in the Middle Ages. My personal opinion, for what it's worth, is that there was a religious war unleashed by a group of intolerant people who saw Beelzebub everywhere, including emperors, and who accused traditional religion of being the product of Satan. The Roman state, apart from Nero that was mad, tried to run for cover, but it was too late. The Christian victims were called martyrs, the pagan victims were simply removed and disappeared from history. The warlike actions of Christians, with death and destruction, perpetuated for more than 1,000 years, were long silenced and even celebrated as acts of God's will. We recall religious persecutions of pagans, witches, Jews, internal wars with the elimination of heretics, Waldensians, Huguenots, and then philosophers such as Giordano Bruno, and total elimination of the cultures and religions of the New World. Constantine had himself portrayed as Apollo. In fact, Constantine, in addition to having had a vision of Christ, also had one of Apollo, which says a lot about this character who, after his conversion, killed his wife by boiling her alive. With his conversion, he began to pour money into the Christian organization, forcing the priests of traditional temples to sell their relics and statues and then give the money to the church. Thus began the systematic stripping of the temples, first the gold, then the statues, then even the stones used to build churches. The dispossession was a political design. Many statues were used in a desecrating way. When that happened, those temples hadn't been abandoned and Christians made up perhaps 10% of the population. The idea that the choice of Constantine was a liberation and that suddenly 10 million of citizens of the empire left their religion to become Christians is a colossal lie. Under Constantine, the Christians spontaneously attacked the temples to plunder them completely unpunished. You can imagine how those who tried to defend the temples of traditional religion ended up. This crime continued for centuries. In the 5th century, the colossal statue of Athena in the center of the Acropolis of Athens, one of the most admirable masterpieces of art of the ancient world, was pulled down from where it had been. Proclus defined Christians as those who move what should not be moved. The stones speak and tell of the furious hubris of the monotheists toward the other more ancient religions. In the Museum of London, you can find the statues of the Parthenon mutilated and scarred. In the Museum of Athens, the statue of Venus was disfigured by a cross carved on the forehead, the eyes and the nose destroyed by hammers. In Cyrene, you can see the same. In Tuscany, a statue of Bacchus was decapitated. In the Archaeological Museum of Sparta, Hera was disfigured with crosses carved over her eyes. The statue of Apollo was castrated and hammered in the face, and there are signs of an attempt of beheading. These are just a few examples of remaining statues. Many more have been pulverized, burned, melted down, leaving traces of gold and ivory. Christian writers applauded the new course in line with the first commandment of the Jewish religion, not to take any images which they did not apply to their saints and Madonnas. In 324, Constantine forbade governors to make sacrifices. In 341, Constantine's son Constantius outlawed sacrifices. Orders were made to close the temples. In 356, the death penalty was inflicted on those who worshipped images. Yes, I repeat, the death penalty was inflicted on those who worshipped images. There was a magnificent temple in Alexandria, the Temple of Serapis, which stood on hundreds of marble steps. The temple was also preserving the volumes saved from the Library of Alexandria. Not a single stone remains of that temple. In 391, the Patriarch of Alexandria, Theophilus, led his band of criminals to destroy the temple of Serapis. Eunapius, a Neoplatonic philosopher, writes, "Without a plausible reason, without the slightest noise of war, the temple of Serapis was destroyed. The statues and votive offering were stolen. Only the floor of the temple was not removed, as the stones were too heavy. And after the destruction, they boasted of having destroyed the gods. Later, they introduced into those sacred places the so-called monks, men in form, but pigs in clothing and in eating." Christian hagiographers recall this ignoble attack without shame. In the case of the destruction of the Temple of Serapis, the pagans reacted. The violent temple destroyer, he was beaten and burned alive by enraged polytheists, who were still the 90% of the population. This was a very evident fact, but there are many other written testimonies of authors of the time, such as Libanius and Symmachus, on other violent facts and cultural repression. Symmachus wrote in defense of the altar of victory when the Emperor Gratianus wanted to remove it from the Senate of Rome in 382. Obviously, the violence was not limited to temples, stones, and symbols. Finally, it all boils down to violence towards people who do not accept the new course. The fathers of church said that it was better to burn them rather than leaving their soul to the evil. We think of the philosopher Hypatia, murdered at the hands of the Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, a saint, and his crew, who, among other things, had also attacked the synagogues and the Jews in the same city. Damascus report, an enormous mass of brutal men, truly evil, killed the philosopher, and while she was still barely breathing, they carved out her eyes. Another myth to dispel is the one according to which Christianity was a bulk work of culture thanks to the scribes who copied precious parchments and kept them in large libraries. This is certainly true, but we have to evaluate it in the general context. From the beginning, the classical world was judged as corrupt and evil. Let us begin with a declared Christian contempt for tragedies and comedies. The actors were treated as if they were prostitutes, the latter obviously done by bigoted prelates. But even works such as the Iliad and the Aeneid were considered a concentration of idolatry, blasphemy, lust, not to mention the works of philosophers such as Pythagoras. Augustine describes pagan philosophy as a madness, mother of evils and diseases. Let's talk about numbers. In the 3rd century in Rome there were 28 public libraries and many private ones. At the end of the 4th century, Ammianus Marcellinus says that the libraries are now like tombs, permanently closed, and describes the persecution and burning of books in Antiochia. Many works have been lost due to a deliberate filter of the Christian world. Books burning was frequent, and in the 6th century there were frequent instances of inquisition, with people imprisoned and tortured if found in possession of suspicious books. The amanuenses recycled the expensive parchments, smoothing the old texts of Ovid, Pliny, Plautus, Cicero, Seneca, Livy, Lucanus to copy their Bibles. In the end, 1% of the texts in the Latin world are thought to have survived. So Christianity has done quite a good job. This is sarcasm, of course. Clearly, the practice of the Gentile Roman religion was at risk of life. Definitely from 356 Edict of Constantius up to at least 1600, when Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake just not to recognize the Trinity. We recall that just in Italy we had to wait until 1848 when King Carlo Alberto sanctioned freedom of worship for Valdesians and Jews. However, some tried to revive the ancient religion. In the 15th century, Pomponian Leto celebrated the Christmas of Rome in his Roman Academy and tried to restore the pontificate, but Pope Paul II dissolved the Academy and persecuted its participants. Between the 19th and the 20th century, Giacomo Boni, archaeologist and senator of the Italian kingdom, made various attempts to restore the Gentile Roman religion in Rome. In Italy, The first pagan magazine was written by Arturo Reghini in 1914. Later, there was a collaboration with Julius Evola. This ferment followed during the 20 years. A new spring started from the end of the 60s with the foundation in Rome, Naples and Messina of the Gruppo Dioscuri. In the 70s and 80s, there was a great ideological ferment. From this cauldron, in the mid-80s, we find the origin of the Movimento Tradizionale Romano, the Traditional Roman movement, as a non-political movement dedicated to the re-emergence of the Gentile Roman religion. At the time, the movement was called traditionalist, but this definition was soon deemed incorrect and after a few years changed to traditional on the decision of the founders themselves and of the members of the board directors, including Daniele Liotta. Daniele Liotta is the president of MTR. And from this route, I speak to you today. As always, we have only presented a summary of the theme, but for further information, I recommend reading The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie. Again, it is not our intention to start a polemic with modern Christianity, but to explain in this cycle of lessons the reason why the Roman religions disappeared. Roman polytheism was violently erased, and we still feel the influence of the historical narrative filtered and distorted by those who won. That is, by those who identified Rome, its traditions, its offices with their devils. Our, therefore, is a heartfelt defense of the Gentile Roman religion in the face of the new that advanced and which, promising salvation, actually brought destruction. The site of the Gentile Roman religion, Roman traditional movement, Saturnia Tellus, offers interesting articles on the whole sphere concerning the Gentile Roman religion. So, if you don't know it, I invite you to take a look on our online magazine. Here ends the first series of lessons on Roman Gentile religion. I want to say thank you to the editorial staff who have helped me up to here, Italo, Paolo and Daniele. So, thank you for following us. Vale bene in pace deorum.